want you to imagine you're along with me on a detective call-out. We've been called out to the death scene, and we're trying to figure out if this death scene is a homicide. There are 4 ways to die. You can die by natural causes. You can die by some accident. You can die by suicide. Or you can be killed by somebody else, a homicide. And we're trying to figure out which of these 4 ways our deceased happen to pass away. Not every death scene is a crime scene. And I'm going to give you a simple skill set that'll help you determine whether this is a death scene or a crime scene. Here we go. It's a principle that I simply call inside or outside the room. If we can explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room for an explanation, it's probably not a homicide. So, for example, if we get inside and we have a dead body and we also have a pistol laying by his side, but all of the evidence in the room we can actually identify back to him. It's his are the only fingerprints we find in the room. The only DNA we find in the room belongs to him. Even the skin cell transfer on the pistol belongs to him. That's actually his pistol registered to him. All the material evidence we find in the room, it comes back to our victim. Okay, well, if everything in the room can be explained by staying in the room, well, this is either a suicide or an accidental. Now, on the other hand, if the stuff that's in the room cannot be explained by staying in the room, if the best explanation is outside the room, we've got to shift our investigation. So, for example, if we've got unknown DNA in the room, we can't figure out who that belongs to. It's not his. Those aren't his fingerprints. That's not even his gun. His friends say he hates guns. So now we got to figure out where that gun come from. What if all the material evidence, if there's mud in the room that tracks out to the outside? Well, now clearly, the best explanation for what's in the room is not a cause in the room. It's a cause exterior to the room. All of our investigation efforts have to shift toward homicide. Why? Well, we have an intruder. That's clear. And when you have an intruder, everything changes. Intruders are the very thing that turn death scenes into crime scenes. Now, I will tell you this simple principle I used about the age of 35. I was not a believer. I was not somebody who believed in God's existence or in any faith system at all. And I simply wanted to know if God existed. And I thought, could I use my investigative template to determine if God existed? What if the room we were looking at is not a death scene, but is instead the entire natural universe? You know, all the space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry that we see here in the natural universe. What if that's the room we're looking at? Can I explain everything that I see in that room by staying in the room? Or is the best explanation something outside of space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, something outside the natural realm? If the best explanation is something outside the room, well, now I got another intruder problem. Only this intruder would span the entire cosmos. That's what we're going to do in these next 8 sessions. We're going to look at 8 things that are in the room of the natural universe, and we're going to ask the question, can you explain these 8 things by staying in the room? We're going to look at the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the appearance of life in the universe, the origin of life, and the appearance of design in the biology we do see in the universe. We'll look at mind and consciousness, free agency, the existence of transcendent, objective moral truths, and even the problem of evil. Those 8 things have to be explained, and there's only 2 ways to explain them. Either we explain them by staying inside the room with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, or we explain them by jumping outside of naturalism, outside, something extra-natural, something supranatural, something supernatural. And we're going to begin today in this first session with the beginning of the universe, because that has to be explained. The universe is not eternally old. According to all the science in the last 150 years, the universe had a beginning. For example, there's good mathematics. Albert Einstein did some mathematics on this. Alexander Friedman did some mathematics on this that demonstrated the universe is not eternally old and has, in fact, been expanding. Wow. And not only that, we have good philosophical reason to believe that all space, time, and matter had a beginning. Even time had a beginning. Now I'm going to ask you to stretch your mind a little bit on this, because this is a difficult one to put your hands around sometimes. But if there's no beginning to time, we cannot be here today. Here's what I mean. If we had a racetrack we were running on, and I told you to stand at that beginning starting line, and I told you to run to the 100-yard marker, but every time you began to get ready to run, I told you to step back a foot. Well, I'm ready to go now. Step back a foot. Ready, get set, go. No, step back a foot. Really? I'm ready to start. Step back a foot. Every time you are about to start, I continue to push you back 1 foot. Well, you're never going to reach the 100-yard line because I won't let you get started. Time is very similar. If I won't let you start time, you can never get to the 100-yard line we call today. The fact that we are here at today means there's a beginning to the race we call time. So even there's good philosophical reasons to believe that time has a beginning. But we see good things, we can observe good things in the universe that tell us the universe had a beginning. Mathematics and philosophy is not enough. We can see through our telescopes that the universe is expanding. We can measure the spectrograph on distant galaxies. They are shifting toward red in the spectrograph because they are moving away from us. And why does that matter? Well, if the universe is expanding, run it backwards. It means it's expanding from something. It's expanding outward because there's a beginning to the universe. Mathematics demonstrates it. Philosophy helps us to think about it. And we can actually see it in our telescopes. In fact, the second law of thermodynamics also helps us to determine the universe has a beginning because the amount of usable energy in our universe is diminishing over time. If you came into the room and you were the first person in the room and you found yourself a little wind-up police car and it was running around the room, the first thing you would do is look for who wound it. Well, why? Because you know that thing has not been running around forever. It wasn't running around overnight. That thing was wound a short time ago, and it's now unwinding before your very eyes. Well, the second law of thermodynamics tells us and demonstrates for us that the universe is unwinding before our very eyes. And that points to a time in the past in which the universe was tightly wound just like the police car. And if you think about that, that demonstrates yet again that we are in a universe that has a beginning. Here's another piece of interesting evidence. The amount of helium in our universe is provocatively high. It's the second largest ingredient. Hydrogen is the first element that we see in the universe, but helium, in order to be generated at the level we see it today, there had to be conditions, according to Sir Fred Hoyle, that were incredibly dense and incredibly hot. Well, this actually makes most sense if, in fact, the universe came from a position of incredible density and heat, expanding outwards, so we see the expansion. Yet another piece of evidence that demonstrates that we're in a universe with a beginning. There's even more reason to believe that we have a beginning to our universe. In 1964, two scientists at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey started to hear something they called cosmic background radiation. We now have actually seen it in satellites. We've photographed it and measured it across the entire universe. This low-level radiation that is still in the background. What explains that? Well, of course, if we have a universe that came into existence from nothing, we would expect that moment to be a moment of high density, high heat, and we would also expect there to be an echo, a lingering radiation that we would see in the background. And that's exactly what we see in the background. So it shouldn't surprise us. This is yet another piece of evidence. Now, here's a diagram that actually shows you how all of these pieces of evidence point to the same conclusion. Whether it's philosophical evidence, mathematical evidence, scientific evidence, they all point to a beginning of space, time, and matter, and therein lies the problem. How do we explain that? By staying inside the room of the natural universe for an explanation. I've seen three popular explanations. Either the universe has been expanding eternally, or it's expanding and contracting over time, and we just happen to be in a period of expansion right now, or there's some greater environment from which an expanding universe could come. We'll be discussing those in more detail in your participants guide, but let me just highlight one explanation that's often offered. Look, if we can redefine what nothing is, then when we say the universe came into existence from nothing, it might make a little more sense. One explanation has been offered, and it's a popular one. For example, I hear it coming out of different academic institutions, like from Lawrence Krauss, who says if we just redefine nothing, look, if there is a space, he says, is a bubbling brew of virtual particles, and these things pop into existence without any cause at all. And if you wait long enough in that kind of an environment, one of these virtual particles could emerge and then eventually expand into a universe. Well, wait a minute. So you're saying there's an environment that has all the ingredients that weren't available to us. Space is a bubbling brew of virtual particles that if you wait long enough, well, that means that you have to have space, time, and matter in order to get space, time, and matter. But nothing is not space, time, and matter. Nothing is nothing. As Aristotle said, nothing is what rocks think about. Nothing. So you don't have those ingredients available to you to get a universe, unless you want to redefine what nothing means. The best explanation for a universe that has space, time, and matter governed by physics and chemistry is simply an eternal first cause that is itself uncaused, that is non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material. Wow. Think about those descriptions I just offered. That kind of sounds like what we typically would attribute to the being we call God. But already, in examining the first piece of evidence related to the universe, we have to step outside of space, time, and matter. We have to get out of the room for an explanation. That's why we have good reason, even in this very, very early part of the investigation, to believe we have an intruder. Okay, we have our template in place. We know we're trying to explain what's in the room of the natural universe by either offering an explanation from inside the room or an explanation from outside the room, just like we had in our death scene. And now we're going to move from the beginning of the universe in session 1. We're going to talk now about the fine-tuning of the universe. I had a case a number of years ago in which a woman was killed in her home, and she was asphyxiated by an overabundance of natural gas. And when it was reported, her mother visited her daughter and discovered, unfortunately, her daughter's death. And when she told us the story, there were several good layers of evidence that pointed to her ex-husband as a suspect. First of all, we had a foundational story about their marriage and the broken nature of their marriage. She had suffered some spousal abuse. He'd even threatened to kill her in the past. So we knew this was a possibility just from the foundational story of their relationship. But when we got to the house, we saw several other suspicious things at a regional level. For example, these were people who seldom locked their doors and seldom closed their windows on warm days. But when her mom got there, the victim's mom got there and saw that the windows were in fact not closed, they were closed and locked. Even when we went inside the actual house, we could see that at the bottom of the staircase, all the pocket doors have been closed to allow the gas to accumulate on the second floor where, unfortunately, this young lady died. So we had regional evidence that also kind of told us it looks like someone's been tampering with this place. At the local level of the room itself, we had a space heater, a heater on the wall where the pilot light had been extinguished so the gas could freely flow in, and somebody had stacked up a bunch of clothing against the closed door of the bedroom so no gas could escape through the room. Now think about that. We've got good evidence here at both the foundational level, the regional level, and the local level of the room itself to believe that we are in an environment that has been tampered with. This is not an accident. We now have an open homicide investigation based on 3 levels of evidence. Well, something similar happens in the universe. As we look at the universe, we see that it is fine-tuned at 3 levels for the appearance of carbon-based life like you and me. Carbon-based life that actually can think and observe the universe to determine that it's fine-tuned. Now you can see it at the foundational level, at the atomic level, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, the gravity, the force of gravity. These are so finely tuned that the smallest variation would create a universe that cannot even sustain itself, let alone sustain life. As a matter of fact, I'll give you an illustration of this. For gravity, the actual fine-tuning of gravity is so strictly constrained that if we had a tape measure and spanned the entire known universe, we just stretched it out from as far as we can see, as far as we know in either direction. That's a long tape measure. Well, if we just varied the force of gravity by 1 inch on that incredibly long tape measure, we would not have a universe right now that supports itself, let alone life. That's how finely tuned gravity is, and every other cosmological constant is equally fine-tuned. At the regional level, we have just the right galaxy and solar system that's fine-tuned to support life. Our galaxy is the right size, it's the right shape, it's the right distance from other galaxies. We are at the right position in the spiral arm of that galaxy. Our solar system, still at this regional level, is just the right size star, just the right composition, just the right mass, just the right heat. Even at the regional level of evidence here, we see fine-tuning. Not only that, at the local level of our planet, planet Earth, it's just the right size, just the right terrestrial depth of our crust of our planet to allow for the tectonic movement of plates, just the right atmospheric conditions. We happen to have a moon of the right size that is not so overbearing that it stops the rotation of Earth, but it allows the kinds of seasons we see in our planet, the kind of tides we see in our planet. All of this is fine-tuned, and altogether we see the same 3 levels of fine-tuning that you and I observed at that crime scene. We have enough reason to believe at the crime scene that the fine-tuning points to a fine-tuner who caused that death. And we can see the illustration. And here we see the illustration, and we have just enough reason to believe from the fine-tuning we see in the universe that there's a fine-tuner that caused our life. So the fine-tuning in one location is very similar to the fine-tuning in another. So how do we explain the fine-tuning we see in the universe? The fine-tuning, by the way, is relatively non-controversial. Even atheists who don't believe in God's existence do agree that we see what appears to be fine-tuning in the universe. The only question is, how do we explain this fine-tuning? They would try to offer an explanation from inside the room. Well, there's maybe 3 or 4 good explanations that they tried to offer in the past, historically, to explain the fine-tuning. None of those actually work, and I've described some of these in your participants guide. But I want to talk about one that has kind of emerged as the most popular explanation, and that is this. If our universe is part of a larger collection of universes, if there is a multiverse in which there are perhaps an infinite number of universes, then why would we be surprised that one of these just happens to look like us? In fact, it's really a matter of just chance. Given enough opportunities, one might emerge just like ours, and so therefore we don't need to resort to a fine-tuner outside the universe. We simply have a universe that by chance is perfectly tuned, perfectly designed. We didn't even say designed, it just by chance happens to support life. Okay, well, let's think about that for a second. First of all, I want to just tell you that this is a very controversial claim, the multiverse. Physicists don't even agree on this claim. They would argue, physicists who don't agree would argue there's not even good evidence scientifically to suggest we have a multiverse. It appears, in many cases, to be an inference based on fine-tuning. In other words, it's being offered simply to explain the fine-tuning. But we would ask, what is the physical evidence that demonstrates there's a multiverse? But even philosophically, I want you to think about this for a minute. If there are an infinite number of universes, and only a small percentage, 0.00000000001%, support organic life, support carbon-based life like ours, well, how many then support carbon-based life? An infinite number, because any fraction of an infinite would be an infinite collection. And if there are, of those that support carbon-based life, 0.0000001% support life of humanoids like ours, well, how many of those are there? They have to be an infinite. And if of those 0.0000001% support life with humans who have the exact same personal history of all of you watching this right now, have the exact same personal history of everyone on our planet, including a person who's standing right now creating curriculum for a book, well, how many of those are there? An infinite number. Do you see the problem with this theory? This theory suggests that there is an infinite number of universes just like ours, behaving just like ours, with the same exact personal histories of humans just like ours. This is why the physicist Alan Guth thinks this idea is preposterous. And what he said is, this is so silly. If there is a multiverse, that means there is a universe right now where Elvis is still alive. For those of you who even know who Elvis was. What it means is small variations in all these universes. There's a universe in which I'm wearing a red shirt, a universe in which I'm wearing a yellow shirt. It becomes preposterous to lean on a theory for which we have no physical evidence that actually leads to logical inconsistencies like this infinite collection of identical universes. And that's why I think the better explanation is simply to point to a fine-tuner when we see fine-tuning. That's not such a radical idea, right? That perhaps there's a fine-tuner who has a goal in mind, a goal to create carbon-based humans just like us, who could then search through the stars, search through the galaxies to find the fine-tuner. This is yet another attribute of our suspect here as we look at the evidence in the crime scene. Remember, every crime scene provides us with evidence that actually describes the nature of our suspect. So far we know that our suspect is all-powerful, non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material. Has he been eternal, is uncaused, first cause, who now has the ability to fine-tune a universe with a purpose in mind. A purpose that people like you and I would emerge and seek him. Now we're going to turn from cosmology to biology. We've talked about some of the cosmological evidence, and I'm trying to explain this evidence by staying in the room or jumping outside the room for the better explanation. Now we're going to shift toward biological evidence, because it turns out there are a couple of features of the universe that just scream for explanation. And one of the biggest one is, how does life emerge from non-life in our universe? As a matter of fact, we've been conducting, scientific community has been conducting origin of life studies for many, many decades. And we're not getting any closer to an answer on that question. As a matter of fact, the more we drill down into the nature of biological life, the more difficult the question becomes. Now, when we do a good investigation of any crime scene, we ask the questions you probably asked when you were writing a good term paper in high school. What, how, when, where, why, who? These are questions we ask to determine what happened at the scene and who is our suspect. Well, the same kinds of questions could be used to examine the universe and the origin of life. And one of the biggest questions to ask is, what are we really talking about here? Now, you will see in your participants guide the difficult nature of biological life. It's pretty complicated. It's pretty complex. It's not a simple problem to solve. And one of the biggest challenges in all of biology is explaining that largest molecule known to humans called DNA. So that's the what question. What we're trying to explain here is incredibly complex. Another question we might ask is where? Where do we think that life could emerge? Well, I will tell you this. When we look at all the locations that have been offered by people who are trying to determine how life originated in the universe, people have suggested it occurs in the early atmosphere of the Earth. Those actual studies have demonstrated that's a pretty tough sell, and so people have moved away from that. They said, well, maybe it occurred in the oceans or the early oceans, but people disagree about that. And maybe it occurred underneath ocean rocks or at the surface of the terrestrial crust. It's been so frustrating because each one of these locations offered doesn't work for a number of reasons. And as a matter of fact, each of these scientists will disagree with each other and say, well, my theory is better than, no, my theory is better. There's no consensus on this at all. As a matter of fact, some now have said that we cannot understand how life could emerge on Earth, so perhaps it was delivered to us on an asteroid or a meteorite from outer space, which just kind of pushes the problem off to another location, but it still begs for explanation. So on the what and the where, we still have some open questions. But when we talk about why did it emerge? What could cause this? Is it a matter of random chance? Is there some aspect of physical law, of physics that made life emerge here? Well, to be honest, we looked at both of those. The odds are so strikingly long against the formation of life from nothing that's really not a good explanation. Sometimes too, when people say chance, what they really mean is I have no explanation at all. So we have to kind of think about that. And in addition to that, we cannot find physical laws of, the laws of physics that could bring together the necessary ingredients for life to emerge. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then we have to ask the question, well, when did it occur? One thing we do know for sure in the entire history of the Earth, life seems to emerge in very striking fashion all at once. The range in which life emerges on planet Earth, even according to the most atheistic scientists, is strikingly short. How do we explain the sudden emergence of species, the sudden emergence of life altogether? So this is something that all of us are searching through to find a good answer. Well, I want to focus in on one thing that I thought, for me at least, was very compelling. And that is this molecule we talked about called DNA. It is the longest molecule known to humans. And it consists of 4 nucleotides that are arranged in a specific order in the molecule called DNA. This order is not just random, it's communicative. It is information. As a matter of fact, the formation of life, all of the micro-machines in your cells, the formation of proteins from amino acids, all of this stuff that occurs in biology is dictated and driven by the genome, by the information, the nucleotide sequence in your DNA. Think about that for a second. If that's really information in DNA, how do we get it? Where does information come from? Stephen C. Meyer is a philosopher of science, and he made a very striking observation, which I think is pretty sound, and that is that we don't have a single example anywhere in the history of science, anywhere in the history of the universe, in which information has ever come from anything other than intelligence. Do you think physical laws can produce information? Some people would say yes. Well, that depends on what kind of information you're actually looking at. So I wanted to describe for you the 4 levels of information, or the 5 levels of information, to show you how complex DNA information is and why it screams for an intelligent mind as the source. Imagine you probably have a dog. I have a dog. I have a great dog, by the way. It's a Welsh Pembroke Corgi named Bailey. I mean, Corgis are great dogs. That's why the Queen has, 10 of these dogs? I mean, it's awesome. But I will tell you that she may not be the smartest dog in the world. If I gave her a typewriter and asked her to bang out a sentence, her first effort looks like what you're seeing here. Is that information? I mean, it's a sequence of letters that are all jumbled around. I mean, is that information? Well, in a sense, it is information. A very low level of information. It's a sequence of letters that's complex. I doubt she could type that same sentence twice. It's pretty complex, but it's not specific. There's no specificity. I see no words. This is a level of information that is called statistics. by an engineer named Werner Gitt, who has done some work on the levels of information. It's the lowest level of information, just like small repeating patterns, even more complex repeating patterns. This is all information, but it's the lowest level of information. Yes, you could get this kind of information from inside the room of the natural universe with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Granted, but this is not what DNA is. Let's go another level. What if Bailey, my dog, could get on that typewriter and she could actually type out words like you're seeing now, but they're not words in any particular sentence order. I still don't know what she's trying to tell me, but hey, at least she knows this. She can code for certain words that I can then understand, recognize, and decode. This is a whole nother level of meaning, a whole other level of information. It's described as cosyntax. Now, this is level 2 information, and there's actually no way to get this level of information from inside the room of the natural universe. You need a mind that can code and understands the formation of words, even understands how these will be read by the receiver. We are now one level outside of what the natural universe can do for you, and we are still not at DNA. This is another level of information, but we're not close to DNA yet. What if Bailey could type out words and actually put them in a sentence? Grandpa is eating. You see, the sentence now has meaning. I understand what Bailey's trying to tell me. She is trying to tell me that Grandpa is eating. This is another level of information. This is called semantics. But we are still not at what DNA is. And we're now 2 levels outside the room of the natural universe in terms of what space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry can deliver. Well, what if Bailey could actually not just type out a sentence, but she can make a request with her sentence? Think about that. Oh my gosh. Well, how would she do that? Here's a sentence, for example. It's clear she wants Grandpa to feed her. Okay, this level of information in which the sender is actually making a request, well, this is a whole other level of information. We're now 3 levels outside of what the room can do, and this level is called pragmatics. It's very useful, very practical. But what if Bailey's even sharper than this? She's asking Grandpa to feed her not because she wants to get fed. She's asking Grandpa to feed her because she knows that after every meal, Grandpa takes her for a walk. If the goal Bailey has is to get something that happens after the request that she knows is coming, this is called apobetics. It's the highest level of information, and it turns out 4 levels now outside what the natural universe can deliver. We are finally at the level that we see in DNA. How in the world are we going to explain this? Remember, low-level information like Bailey's first sentence you see here is no way to tell what it means. And I can even take a character out, and it makes no difference in terms of meaning. But go to the highest level of information. Do you see her sentence here? Let's eat, Grandpa. Well, if we take out the comma, the same comma we took out in the first sentence, do you see how the entire meaning of the sentence changes? This is no longer Bailey asking to be fed. This is Bailey who wants to eat Grandpa. Do you see the difference? This is how we know it's the highest level of information. Well, think about this. You and I, we have a DNA code that describes everything about us. And there are now genetic therapies in which all they try to do is change the information in the DNA because subtle changes to the nucleotide sequence produces physical changes in meaning, in structure, in how we are as humans. This tells us that DNA is at the highest level of information. Far more than statistics, we are looking at the level that has now been called apobetics. And the reason why that's so powerful is because we've got to try to explain how we've got that kind of information in our universe. Can we stay inside the universe to explain that? Now, there are a couple of ways that people have tried to explain it, and they all fail. They can't explain really how we get this level of complexity and specificity in DNA. They can't explain where this might emerge. They can't explain when this might emerge. Now, there is another explanation for DNA. If it's not going to be chance, which it isn't, and it's not going to be physical law, which they have to demonstrate to us that physics can somehow produce information, and they haven't. There's another option, and that is that it truly is information. Information that comes from a mind. Now here's what I'm seeing. In all those questions we started with, the what, when, why, where, who questions, the one question that science refuses to ask is the who. They're willing to ask the what, when, why, how, where, no problem. But what if all the evidence we have points to a who and not a what? Are they willing to ask the who question? Well, no, they're not. Well, why not? We don't do science that way, Jim. Really? Well, why don't you ask who questions? Because there are no who's in the natural universe us to ask. It's a what. It's going to be a what. Well, wait a minute. What if all the best evidence you had points to a who? Are you willing to entertain the possibility of a who? And here we have something in the universe, information, which is best explained by a who, an intelligent mind that is the source of the information in the DNA. Once again, we have to jump outside the room of the natural universe to explain what we see in the room of the natural universe. An all-powerful, timeless, spaceless, non-material, uncaused first cause that is a fine-tuner, creating a universe that has purpose and meaning and is designed to support life. But not only that, he is communicating to us through the DNA in order to originate life in this universe. He's set the table and now he's delivered the goods. And we are outside the room for our explanation. There's another important piece of evidence in biology that has to be explained by either staying inside the room or jumping outside the room of the natural universe for an explanation. Let me give you an illustration of this. I had a crime one time, it was a sad crime, in which a woman was killed with a really interesting device. She was killed with a garrote. A garrote is a strangulation device. It's wire attached by two handles. Now, when the officers got to the crime scene, the killer actually left the garrote at the scene, and they decided to collect it as evidence. Now, you might think, well, of course they did. Well, why? Why would they collect it as evidence? Why would they think that these two pieces of wood and wire were anything more than a broken piece of there's a ficus plant in the room. It's got a wooden dowel. It's got some wire attached around the tree. Couldn't it have just come from that? Couldn't it have just broken off from some piece of furniture in the room? They said, no, I don't think it's that. I think it's going to be something that has been designed by the killer to commit this crime. Well, okay, that's really interesting. So they thought, just on the appearance of this device, that it was designed. They looked at it and they said, this appears to be designed by somebody. Well, what is it exactly that we determine as designed? What is it we use? What are the tools that we look at, that we consider in our heads to decide if something is just created by natural forces or was instead designed by a creative mind? I've been thinking about that for about 20 years. My background is as a designer. I have a bachelor's degree in design and a master's degree in architecture. And so a lot of my early career was spent in design. And I knew that my illustrations appeared to be designed. But what is it about the garrote that made it appear to be designed? Well, I think there are actually 8 things, and I want to show them to you in a diagram. I think that these 8 things, when considered together, really have the best inference you can make is that this object has been designed. And I want to talk about those 8 things very, very briefly. The first is that if you can't explain the appearance of this thing through chance, just random chance, probabilities of, hey, maybe if you have enough time, this wood and this wire would have come together by chance. Really? That's not a great explanation for the wood and the wire. So that we can kind of move from that. And if it's not by chance, you only have another possibility. It's either by physical law or by design. So if there's no way to explain it by chance, there's a good inference that it's designed. Also, you got to think about it in terms of, does it look like something that you recognize that you know already is designed? The officers, when they collected this piece of evidence, this was back in the day, 1970s, and they had just seen a movie called The Godfather. And in The Godfather, there were 2 killings in which a garrote was used. And they figured, hey, I've seen that garrote before. I've seen people design a garrote in the movies, and this looks like that garrote. So if we know that thing is designed and this thing looks like that thing, why wouldn't we think this thing is designed? So if it looks like something that's designed that you already know exists and is designed, that's a good inference to make that the thing you're considering, the garrote, is also designed. But there's more than that. There's a level of intricacy here. If you look at the way the garrote was made, I looked at it very carefully, the kinds of knots at the end of the wire where it was wrapped around were sophisticated knots, making it even more unlikely it could happen by chance. When you see a certain level of sophistication, design is a good inference. And not only that, this seemed to me to be informationally driven. In other words, as it turned out, the killer in this case used a handbook in order to design his garrote. This is kind of crazy, but believe it or not, only one group could I find in the history of America that have actually been trained to build and use garrotes. Those are naval aviators in World War II. And it turns out our killer's father was a naval aviator, and I think likely he had access to the book that they used to train them how to make garrotes just like this. When you've got an object that is dependent upon information And because we know information comes from minds, a good inference is that the object is designed. Also, there's a goal. When you see a goal appears to be in the actual design, like the designer or whoever caused this had a goal in mind, design's a good inference. And if you look at other devices that are similar to the garrote, like the devices we use to cut wax or to cut clay, they don't have big handles on the ends the way, for example, this garrote does. The handles tell me that whoever was going to use this piece of wire knew he was going to exert incredible pressure, and he was going to need handles so he wouldn't cut himself. Even the handles give me some idea of the goal of this object. And when you think something has been designed or created with a goal in mind, design is a better inference than chance or law. But let's talk about law for a second. Can natural physical laws, the laws of physics and chemistry, could they have brought these two pieces of wood together with this wire to create the garrote? Could I put them in a drawer separately and open and close the drawer a bazillion times? How many times would I have to do that before this would emerge as a garrote? Well, there's no physical law that'll make that happen. And if it's not chance and it's not physical law, design is a good inference. But there's more. There's this thing called irreducible complexity. What I mean is, mousetraps, for example, are irreducibly complex to 6 pieces. We've tried to build a 5-piece mousetrap. It'd be cheaper to build, but we cannot figure out how to do it. They are irreducibly complex to 6. Our garrote is irreducibly complex to 3. Why that's important is the evolutionary processes have a difficult time explaining irreducible complexity. Remember, evolution is one mutation acted on over time, then another mutation, then another mutation. If the device we're looking at isn't even functional or operational until it has 6 pieces in place, well, then you know some slow, progressive creation process is not in place. You know somebody has put all 6 pieces of that mousetrap together at once. Design is the better inference when you see irreducible complexity. And finally, when you see that there's a choice of things that the designer could have used, but instead he decided to use this, and our killer used the garrote because he wanted to be quiet at the crime scene. He knew that the victim was living right next door to another set of residents, and so he wanted to use a quiet device. He thought he could strangle her before she would make a sound. The fact that he chose something specific to that location tells us that the best inference is a designer in this case of the weapon. Now, why do I spend all this time telling you this? Because I think there are things in biology that scream design. Even atheists will concede that there is the appearance of design in biology. Let me give you an example. The poster child of all of this is something that Michael Behe, a biochemist from Lehigh University, discovered years ago. It is something called a bacterial flagellum. I'll show you the diagram. This is a small device, a machine that exists in biology that we see at the molecular level. It spins a whipping tail and it mobilizes, it moves bacteria. It is a rotary engine. And as you look at this, you probably think to yourself, yeah, you know, it does look like a rotary engine. As a matter of fact, here's a diagram that shows it alongside man-made rotary engines. Now, what's interesting about this little device, which is created with 40 specifically shaped proteins that all have to be active together at the same time, a 39-piece machine will not work. You need a 40-piece machine in order for this to spin the tail. All of these, I think, scream design based on the template I just showed you. Here's the template laid on top of the bacterial flagellum. Can you see that chance is not going to explain this formation of proteins to make this little molecular motor? Also, it looks like something we know is, as a matter of fact, we were building rotary engines that looked just like this for years before we ever discovered this one in biology. Our rotary engines that look just like this are not copied from the bacterial flagellum. The bacterial flagellum actually looks like it's copied from a rotary engine. And if you know the rotary engine's design, why wouldn't you think this is designed? Not only that, there's a level of complexity in how this spins the rotor. It spins it by a chemical charge, electrical charge that's chemical, that is still under active investigation by biologists. It is a modern wonder of the universe. That kind of complexity is hard to explain from natural processes. Design is a better inference. And is it informationally driven? Yes, you already know. DNA drives all of this. It's DNA that actually instructs the construction of the 40 proteins to make the bacterial flagellum. And is it goal-oriented? yes, when the DNA instructs it in steps called operons, sentences in the DNA that say first build this part, then build that part, then build the next part, then build the third, and it does this one step after it, and then at some point it stops building. Why? Because it's done. It's reached its goal. It's clear that the information from DNA is goal-driven, and when it reaches its goal, it stops. And can you explain this from some natural forces of physics? No. As a matter of fact, we don't even have natural forces of physics we can use to explain how all the pieces of the motor might come together, let alone how this entire thing is formed from scratch. We don't have an explanation with just physics. And is it irreducibly complex? Not to 6 like a mousetrap, it's irreducibly complex to 40. That means that the best explanation is that something causes all 40 to come together, because we would need evolution to take it one step at a time from 1 to 40, and there is no evolutionary pathway that people can point to show how that could happen. As a matter of fact, we see 5 or 6 or 7 proteins in this machine that are specific to just this machine. They exist nowhere else in the bacteria to be evolved from. And finally, we're looking at, is it a selection process? There are lots of different molecular motors in biology. This one seems to be specifically chosen for this purpose in this organism. Now, why is this powerful? Think about it. How do we explain this by staying inside the room? If the best inference related to this machine is that it has all the attributes you see in the diagram here, all the attributes of design, the same attributes of design we used to identify the garrote as designed, why would we not think it's designed? How do we explain design by staying in the room? Well, I can only see one potential explanation that's ever been offered, and that is that somehow evolution has co-opted something that is significantly robust. Typically in this case, it's something called a type 3 secretion system. I'll show it to you. This type 3 secretion system is similar in its appearance to the rotary motor, but the problem we have with this is that the type 3 secretion system also displays all the attributes of design. You can't borrow something designed, add a few pieces, and then say we have something that's not designed. But worse yet, we now know by dating these two small machines that the bacterial flagellum is actually older than the type 3 secretion system. So we don't have an evolutionary process that jumps up. By the way, that process is called co-option. So if we look at this diagram, how in the world are we going to explain this by staying inside the room? We have to hope that some evolutionary explanation will emerge, but it's not. Now, if it looks like it's designed, there might just be a mind outside the universe that is a grand designer, that is intelligent enough to be the source of information in the DNA that guides this process, that then can be said to be the intelligent designer that explains the design we see in the universe. Now look at our suspect description. Pretty robust, right? We've got a spaceless, timeless, non-material, eternal, all-powerful, creative mind that has fine-tuned the universe and is actually the source of information in DNA, which we use as the origin of life. And now we can say that same creative mind is the best explanation for the appearance of design we see in biology. 4 categories of evidence that are best explained by staying inside the room? I don't think so. The best explanation is still outside the room. Okay, we've talked now about 2 pieces of evidence from cosmology and 2 pieces of evidence from biology. And now we're going to move toward 2 pieces of what I call mental evidence, where again, we're trying to explain this evidence. We don't have 2 options. Either we stay inside the room of the natural universe, space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, or we jump outside the natural realm for the better explanation if there is one. Now, I want to talk about the idea of consciousness for a minute. We sometimes, take it for granted, but you've been thinking about all of these lines of evidence all through this curriculum series. What are you using in order to think about? Are you using your brain? Well, in a sense you are. Are you using your mind? Do you think you actually possess a mind? Sometimes when we're working criminal investigations, we have to identify suspects. And it can be confusing because the person might say, I know the person who did this is J. Warner Wallace. But somebody else might know me as Jim Wallace. Well, how do I know that J. Warner Wallace is the same person that somebody else describes as Jim Wallace? Well, if all of my attributes as J. Warner Wallace are identical to all the attributes I have as Jim Wallace, then this one-to-one relationship, this law of identity, says that we are one and the same person. Jim Wallace is, in fact, identical to J. Warner Wallace, at least this Jim Wallace. Okay, this law of identity is helpful because when we start to think about consciousness, we have to ask the question, are we entirely physical beings? Are we using our brain right now to think about this, or are you using your mind to? We seem to have this sense, this experience of consciousness. But how do we explain that experience if atheism is true and all we can use to explain our consciousness is space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? Look, the brain is easier to explain, right? It's physical. If we are in a physical universe, then physical things like brains make sense. But non-material things, things that, say, Christians often think exist, like angels and demons and souls and minds, these are not easy to explain in a physical universe. This is why philosophers typically call this the problem of mind. Well, how do we explain mind? Do we actually have minds? Some are inclined to say, well, no, we're in a physical universe governed by physical laws, so all we really have is a brain, and everything you think you're experiencing as a mind is simply an artifact of your physical brain. But I'm here to tell you, I think there is good evidence to indicate that your mind is something different than your brain, and we're going to use the law of identity to do it. Here's what I mean. If every aspect of brain is identical to every aspect of mind, then we can just say there are no minds. It's just we're experiencing our brain activity. But if there are different properties to mind than there are to brain, then we'd have to at least concede that there are two different things. There are certain things that are true about brains and certain things that are true about mind. Let me offer you several lines of evidence to help you see that these are, in fact, two different things. The first is a very simple one. It's the distinction between public and private. Your brain is entirely public, but your thoughts, your mind is entirely private. So I could, for example, take off your skull cap and have to run an experiment where I am looking at your physical brain. I could see your physical brain. It's publicly available to me. But your mind is not publicly available to me. It's privately held by you. Even if I could see some activity, that neurons that are firing in your brain, I'd have to ask you, well, what are you thinking? To try to associate that with your brain. Your brain is publicly available. Your thoughts are privately held. And this difference between public and private demonstrates at the very first level that we are talking about two different things here, brain and mind. There's another distinction between mind and brain that's really interesting, and philosophers call this intentionality. What it means is basically this. Our mental states are they are always about something. We worry about our job. We think about what we're going to eat for lunch. They are not what we would say self-existent. Well, the lunch is self-existent. Some things, material things, they just exist. They are self-existent. But your thoughts, your mental states are not self-existent. They are about something else. That makes them very different. So your brain exists, it's self-existent, but your thoughts, your mind, the activity in your mind, your mental states they're dependent on something else. They are not self-existent. This difference I call the difference between isness, things that just are, and aboutness, things that are about something else. So this difference between isness and aboutness, as I call it, is yet another difference between your brain and your mind. Let me give you another example of the difference between mind and brain. I might hear a noise in the next room and think there's a burglar in the next room. But I'm wrong. There's no burglar in the next room. I'm afraid there is. Now, I could be wrong about the presence of a burglar, the existence of the burglar in the next room, but my fear of the burglar in the next room is indisputable. This is the difference between physical things and mental states. You cannot dispute that I'm having a belief, I'm having a fear, that's indisputable, but the actual physical reality of the thing I'm worried about, the thing I'm afraid of, that is something we could falsify. And this is yet again the difference between physical things like burglars and brains and non-physical things like minds and beliefs, fears, and thoughts. We've now discovered yet another thing that separates mind from brain. Yet another way that minds are different than brains. Look, we get trained all the time to experience some crazy things in law enforcement. And you can train us in a certain way on what we're going to experience. You can tell us in advance of what your body is going to do when confronted with violence or confronted with a threat. You can understand the physiology of your body. But until you've experienced it firsthand, You could think you know everything there is to know, but you haven't experienced it, and you don't yet know what your reactions are going to be, how you're going to perceive things differently. In other words, there are a set of things that can be known impersonally and objectively because we can examine the physical nature of these things. But your experiences, your reactions, we cannot do. We cannot know those things. Those are subjective. Those are the things that you experience personally. And this difference between objective, impersonal, physical realities and the personal reactions we have subjectively is yet another distinction between physicality, brains, and non-physicality, minds. And let me give you one more that seems pretty obvious. I could actually remove my brain and measure it in some way. I could put it on a scale, measure its weight. I could measure its width. I could measure its length. I could measure its mass. But you cannot measure the mass of your thoughts. You cannot measure the length of your thoughts or the weight of your thoughts. There are differences between mental states and physical states. And one is immeasurable and one is measurable. Yet another difference, let's put it in diagram form. Take a look at this diagram. This diagram shows you 5 lines of evidence that distinguish mind from brain. We have good reasons to believe that your brain is not the same as your mind. Now, why is that important? Well, think about it. If we're staying inside the realm of the universe to explain what we experience in our thought life, well, brains are easy to explain because they could be part of a process, a physical process governed by physical laws that could produce a physical brain. But minds are entirely immaterial. How do we get mind, something immaterial? What evolutionary process can deal with matter, and suddenly something immaterial emerges? How does that happen? This is why we call it the problem of mind. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of people who have tried to describe this from inside the room. And what they typically do is, in many cases, is try to redefine what we mean by mind, change the definition to make it a little easier, or they'll offer an explanation that really is not supported by any evidence. They'll say that maybe the mind's emerged through some physical process, but we have no actual evidence that that is the case. I will be talking about some of these in your participants guide, so take a look. I'll go through some of the explanations that people offer from within the room, but I want to feature one and highlight it here. And that is this something called behaviorism. If we could redefine our thoughts, our mental states, as simply behaviors, so to say that I'm sad and then you see me frowning, what you're really describing is the behavior of frowning. So the sad thing, this word you're using to describe frowning is simply a description of a physical behavior. Well, that makes it easier to explain from inside the room, right? Because it's just a physical behavior described by physical laws are governing a physical universe. Now, there's a problem with behaviorism, though, because think about it. There are times when I'm sad, but I don't express it. And if I'm not expressing it, how can you call my behavior as identical to my thought life? It's not. There's times when I will also, if behavior is identical to your thought life, I wouldn't even know how I feel until I look in the mirror and see what my behavior is. But clearly, I have something that precedes all of that, a sensation, a thought, a feeling, a response that precedes my physical action, my physical behavior. This idea that behaviors could somehow be identical to your thought life and therefore could be explained by physical processes just doesn't work. Now, there is another way to get conscious mind, another way to get consciousness. What if the source of everything we see in the universe is itself a mind that creates in its image other living beings that possess a characteristic of the Creator? We have minds, just like the creative mind that created us. That would explain why we experience the kind of consciousness we experience that cannot be explained through physical processes or with any of the explanations that I'm offering from inside the room in your participants guide. And now we have another attribute we can add to our list describing this causal suspect that is responsible for everything we see in the universe. It appears that he is timeless, spaceless, immaterial. He is an uncreated, uncaused first cause that's all-powerful, that is creative enough to just fine-tune the universe with purpose for life to emerge, and then is the source of information in biology that is responsible for all DNA, and that is also the designer behind the design we see in biology, and is a mind that designs in its image other beings that have minds. We have another fifth piece of evidence that cannot be explained from inside the room. The best explanation is, once again, outside the room. Okay, so we've looked now at several important pieces of evidence, and we're right in the middle of the evidence that really comes from our experience of mind. And this is important in this next category, in this next piece of evidence we're going to talk about, because free agency, your ability to think freely, to make free choices, is really tied to your notion of what it is making those free choices. Is this just a product of your mind or a product of your brain? Which is it? And this is an important distinction we have to make. Let me offer it to you this way. I once worked a case involving a residential burglar, and we watched him. I was working undercover. We watched him do a burglary. And afterwards, we took him to jail for the burglary, and I had a chance to learn more about him. And here's what I learned. I learned that his entire family was involved in this kind of crime. His dad had been a lifetime burglar. His brother had been a burglar. His dad was in custody for burglary. So was his brother. Also, I learned that he was taking, drugs at the time he did the crime. He was high at the time he did the crime. Now, you could argue, and I think he actually was inclined to do this with me as we were sitting talking about this, that, hey, I don't know how you can blame me for this. Because to be honest with you, this is in my family. It's in my bones. It's in my DNA. That's what we do. Everyone in my family does this kind of stuff. Not only that, my brain chemistry was altered by the narcotic. How could you blame somebody if, in fact, all their actions are tied to their DNA or tied to the physical nature of their brain? You can't blame someone for having blue eyes. That's just a product of their DNA and the structure of their eyes. Those are innate qualities we can't blame you for. How could you? Look, think about this. Can you blame this burglar? Can we prosecute him? Could we try him in court and find him guilty? Or did he really have no choice in the matter? If all he is a physical being who possesses a brain that's already pre-wired in a certain way and is now being affected chemically by drugs, it seems to me he's actually a victim here. He's not blameworthy at all. He's blameless. This is the problem if we assume that everything about us is merely physical. If we have brains but not minds, this presents a problem for us. And this is why, if we are in an atheistic universe made up of nothing more than space, time, and matter, a physical universe that can account for physical brains but cannot explain immaterial things like mind, well, then we've got a problem, because every action that you take is not a result of a free choice made in your non-material, non-physical mind, but is simply a consequence of the physical nature of your brain. A neuron fired. And why did it fire? Because a prior neuron fired. You had no control over all of those neurons. They're simply physical processes, dominoes that are falling against each other. And dominoes don't make choices. It's event causation rather than agent causation. Two different ways things are caused. When dominoes fall against each other, one event causes the next event. And none of these dominoes are personal agents that can decide not to fall. Just get out of the way. Dominoes can't do that. Physical structures like your brain cannot explain the kind of free agency that you and I experience every day. If we have minds that can act without the constraints and limits of the physical world, which is always just a series of consequences of prior events that occurred, if we can't make those kinds of free choices, then number one, we can't be blamed for any of our actions, because really we didn't do it. The physical nature of our bodies did it. Two, we can't really rationally think because we can't choose freely between rational options. Three, we can't be creative because we're not making choices that you could call creativity. We can't even love because that's something we must choose to do freely, or it really has no meaning. As a matter of fact, the most important things that you think are part of your experience as a human, love, rationality, creativity, and even culpability, are not available to you if all you are is a brain that is being acted upon by physical events. So the idea of free agency is rather difficult to explain from standing inside the room of the physical universe. And people have tried to explain it. As a matter of fact, there are many people who would just reject that we really have this kind of free agency. As a matter of fact, Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist and a philosopher and is an atheist, says that this is entirely an illusion. This idea that you have free agency, well, not quite so, because you cannot control the neurons that fire in your brain. And this goes back all the way, by the way. The first domino is at the very beginning of the universe, and it sets in course a series of dominoes that fall that lead up to today. All of this was predetermined by your physics. Now, if that's the case, we cannot do all those things we just talked about, and we cannot be held accountable. So let's talk about this for a second. How are we going to explain this? By staying inside the room. I can explain brain. I get that. We can explain brain, but how do we explain mind? I can explain the physical determinism of your physical brain, but how do I explain the free agency we seem to experience as minds that think freely? Now, we're going to talk about some of the ways that people try to stay inside the room for an explanation for free agency, and we're going to describe those in your participants guide. But I just want to kind of skip across a couple of these so you can kind of see why these don't work. Look, some people will say, well, if the activity in your brain is at the quantum level, well, we know at the quantum level that there's not the same kind of causal relationships. So, like, for example, at the quantum level, things pop into existence without really any necessary cause. What if your mental activity is actually physical activity in your brain that is occurring at the quantum level? Well, that means it would be rather indeterminate. And so it's not going to be predetermined. It's not going to be like a series of dominoes. These things emerge like thoughts emerge, and they need no prior cause. But think about that for a second. Are we really willing to say that our thoughts are entirely indeterminate? Well, then why would you trust your thoughts? If this is just quantum activity popping into existence, why would we have any confidence that the quantum activity is connected even to a chain of logic? I think that's rather scary, actually. To assume that your thoughts are entirely disconnected from anything and just pop into existence at the quantum level means that I really don't know if what I'm saying right now makes any sense at all or where it even came from, because they're entirely indeterminate. So I don't know that the quantum theories for thoughts are ever going to really solve the problem. There are some people who think this just emerged mysteriously at the end of a physical process, that this idea of free agency simply emerges even though all the factors that lead up to its emergence are constrained as event causes, event causation, that suddenly agent causation emerges. But I'm not sure we could ever find a way to demonstrate that evidentially. It's a theory. I'm sure we can say, well, it's just so because I say it so, but it doesn't mean it's actually evidentially true. Look, every effort, and here's the diagram, every effort to describe the universe in such a way as to account for free agency from within the constructs of just space, time, and matter, guess what? It doesn't work. Now, there's another way to explain free agency, right? It's kind of the way we explain mind. If there is a mind that is the creator of everything, that acts freely to create when it did not have to, and then it creates beings that are also minds that can act freely. In other words, it creates in its image. So take a look at this list. This is our suspect description that has emerged after 6 pieces of evidence. We are looking for an uncaused first cause that is all-powerful, that is spaceless, timeless, non-material, that is the fine-tuner that has fine-tuned a universe with the purpose of achieving life in the universe, that is the author of the code, DNA code, that is so important to life, that is the designer behind the design, appearance of design we see in biology, that is the mind that creates beings in its image, that also acts freely, that creates when it didn't have to. It creates beings that have minds that also act freely. Now look at this list. That's a robust set of characteristics. And what are we describing here? One thing we know for sure, nothing inside the room of the universe can actually account for this growing suspect profile. Once again, we're looking for a cause for all the stuff we see in the room that is still outside the room. Okay, we're about to turn a corner and talk about some things that are highly philosophical as opposed to science, right? We've talked about the cosmological evidence, we've talked about the biological evidence, the evidence from neuroscience and mind and free agency, but now we're going to talk about something that really hits home for me as a detective. We're going to talk about the moral evidence. The moral evidence. I can tell you, I spent a couple of years working gangs in South Central Los Angeles area. And I met a lot of interesting people doing that. And one of these interesting people was a gangster who ended up torturing a fellow gangster because that fellow, not in his gang, a different clique, so it was another gangster across town, that he ended up torturing because that gangster had kind of said some suggestive things to his sister. He took offense to that. Well, when we finally took him to custody and we talked about this with him, he didn't see anything wrong with what he had done. As a matter of fact, he suggested this was really the law of the streets, that if he had done that to his sister, he would have expected that guy to come and do that to him. For this guy named Jesse, he really felt like this was part of a moral code that was entirely appropriate. He accepted this as proper, virtuous behavior given the law of the street that he actually lived. Now, I will tell you that even in his situation, there were some people who reigned over his moral law. So, for example, he would never do anything to break the law of his clique, his gangsters, his fellow gangsters. They had a moral code, and Jesse knew that he had to bend his knee to that moral code. And even though they might have been gangsters living in our city, they also knew they would get a ticket if they parked someplace on the city they shouldn't park. So even that gangsters, they would say, hey, in that gang, they would not break the city municipal codes because they didn't want to have their cars towed. So there's still an overarching authority even over the gang, and the gang is overarching over Jesse. And in the city of Los Angeles, I mean, we have to kind of bend our knee to several laws and restrictions that are offered by the state of California. So there's an overarching hierarchy of law from the state of California that's over the city of Los Angeles, which is over the gangster group that Jesse was a part of. And you can see how you could extend this out. And see, there's a hierarchy of law. There's national laws that govern all the states. Some people would argue that there's international laws that govern nations. I get that. The question is, how far does this hierarchy go? Does it stop at some point? Where are moral laws grounded? Can these be explained by staying inside the room of the universe? Or is there some better explanation for the overarching moral laws? Look, to begin with, we would say that there are some objective moral truths. And if you wonder what those are, simply add the expression "for the fun of it" behind any crime. So, for example, you might say it's okay to lie to achieve a greater end. If I've got to lie in order to steal, to prevent 1 million people from being destroyed by a terrorist, if I need to steal in order to steal a code so he can't push the button to destroy 1 million people, well, I could justify this in some way. But if you put the expression "for the fun of it" behind lying, suddenly you've discovered an overarching, objective, moral truth claim that is true for all of us. It's never okay, it never has been okay to lie for the fun of it, to steal for the fun of it, to kill for the fun of it. Put the "for the fun of it" on your sentence, and suddenly you've discovered a number of objective, transcendent moral claims, moral truths, moral obligations. So we know these things exist. The question is, how do we ground them? I can tell you I was an atheist for 35 years, and I think I behaved morally most of the time. Of course, but I'm the judge of that, right? How do I ground my moral behavior? I might know not to hurt somebody, but how do I ground it? How do I describe where that comes from, where that overarching, objective, transcendent moral truth comes from? You can behave well, but not know why you're behaving well or how it's grounded. So for me, I, at some point as a detective, wanted to know, well, where do these moral truths come from? Are they there's only a couple of options. If I'm going to explain moral truths from inside the room of the universe, then I have to use the stuff that's available to me. Space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry, and also the beings that emerge from space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Perhaps all moral laws are simply a matter of personal opinion. That is one way that people try to explain moral laws, by staying inside the room of the universe. But if that's the case, and you disagree with me on a moral issue, how do we adjudicate between the two of us? You'd have to say that you're right and I'm right, even though we completely disagree on this moral claim. Because we could never adjudicate. There's no one who stands above the individual person if all moral laws come from individuals. That doesn't seem to work, and we know that doesn't work practically. Well, perhaps it's groups of individuals. That would also be inside the universe, right? So it's still going to come from individuals, but now in large groups. We obey certain rules, certain laws, certain predispositions, moral predispositions, because as a group we have decided together to obey that moral law. Okay. But then what happens then when we have two different groups that disagree on a moral truth? Well, how are we able to tell the Germans in World War II that their atrocious treatment of Jews in prison camps is not okay? They would say, well, in our culture, this was okay. So if cultures decide what's okay, well, we're okay. Well, no, we said there's a law above the law. There's a law that's overarching above both of us, and we have to obey that law. Well, how do we explain that? If it's not coming from individuals, and it's not coming from groups of individuals, from where else can it come? Now remember, the important thing here is that I don't think I have any moral obligations to this clicker. I don't have any obligations to my coat. You don't have moral obligations to inanimate physical objects. All moral obligations are between persons. So whoever is the source of these moral laws, that has to be a person. You are also not morally obligated to physics. But moral obligations drive us to look for the moral person that is the foundation for moral law. If we can't stay inside the room to describe the source for morality from persons or from groups of persons, there does seem to be one other option that some people have gravitated toward, and that is it perhaps a product of our biology? Is it perhaps, as Sam Harris would say, writing about this, the neuroscientist and philosopher who's also an atheist, that this is simply a matter of our biology, our common, overarching human desire to flourish? Well, okay, so is human flourishing, human well-being, the overarching source of moral law? Okay, what do you mean by flourishing? Do you mean survival? Because clearly, I've seen people behave very, very poorly in history as groups or as individuals, and it has actually aided in their survival. You can behave atrociously and improve your survival chances. But I think most people will say, well, yeah, but that's not human flourishing. There's a certain kind of survival that we would say is good, is virtuous, aids well-being. It aids your flourishing. But there's the problem. If you're going to say there's a certain kind of survival, you have to start with a moral notion that you haven't earned yet. You have to start, because remember, if all moral notions are simply aiding your survival, no, flourishing, a certain kind of survival, well, now you're stealing a moral idea that precedes your idea of flourishing. So it's kind of a cheat, if you think about it, to say that it's human flourishing that drives our moral behavior, because you've got an idea in your mind about what that is. And your idea is full of moral content, but if moral content comes from flourishing, it can't precede flourishing to describe it. Do you see the problem? So when we try to stay inside the room of the universe to describe where objective, transcendent moral law comes from, where moral truth comes from, most of these explanations will not get it done. Well, none of them will get it done, and none of them also will point back to the person to whom we feel obligated. If there are objective, transcendent, moral laws and obligations, who is the objective, transcendent, moral lawgiver to whom we feel obligated? It can't be a what, because we're not morally obligated to what's. We're only morally obligated to who's. The best explanation for the moral truths that we feel press upon us inside the room is a lawgiver, a personal lawgiver that's outside the room. And the laws we feel, the obligations we feel in the room are not his creation, his willy-nilly creation, and they're not also the things that he just recognizes and tells us. No, instead they are a reflection of his holy moral character. An all-powerful God has the ability to eliminate moral imperfection. And if he can do that, he becomes a standard we can trust and stand on. So now we've looked at our evidence, right, in the room. We've started to develop a suspect description, given all the cosmological evidence, the biological evidence, all the mental evidence, and now one piece of the first half of the moral evidence. And what we see is we're looking for, again, that all-powerful first cause, that's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, that is the designer that fine-tunes the universe, authors life, is responsible for the design we see in life, who creates as a mind freely beings in its image that also are minds who act freely and feel morally obligated because we have an author. We have a reflection of God's holy nature in the universe that we sense, even if we don't believe. We sense that and we respond accordingly. The best explanation, once again, is outside the room. I get asked this question all the time. Why did this happen to my loved one? When you work homicides, this question is going to be asked by every victim family. I can remember a time when I was asked this question by a family of a very young girl who was kidnapped in our city and killed. And as her name I'll use for purposes of this illustration is Jackie. Why would anyone do something like this to Jackie? Well, the answer to these kinds of questions are always complex. They always involve a series of explanations that we puzzle together as detectives to know why this happened, or to discover why this happened. Look, Jackie was the kind of girl who would get in a car, the car of a stranger. If she wasn't that kind of girl, this crime doesn't happen. And this happened on a holiday where her parents said, get out and play. Don't come back in here for a couple hours. We're making dinner. Okay, if it's on a holiday and she isn't the kind of girl who gets in a car, this doesn't happen. Two factors have to be in place. Two things have to be perfectly in place before this can happen. Third, the person who did this was somebody who has probably I've worked these kinds of suspects before, and usually the kinds of people who would do this to a young child have had a disturbing upbringing of their own. If there isn't somebody out there who has had that disturbing upbringing, if this isn't a holiday and she's not the kind of kid who gets into her car, this doesn't happen. Three conditions have to be met. And this is a part of our city which was really niche-y. It wasn't close to a major highway. I mean, how would you even know to get in that part of the city and how to get back out again? If you don't know that part of the city well, and you're not the kind of person who's been raised with this kind of disturbing background, and you know, and she isn't the kind of kid who gets in a car and it's not a holiday, four things have to be in place or this doesn't happen. Also, he had to have the kind of vehicle that would actually facilitate this kind of crime. A fifth thing. And a sixth thing, he has to have a time frame that's very, very narrow in which to do this and actually be able to successfully complete it and get rid of her body. Pretty gruesome stuff, right? But look at my diagram. These six things have to be in place, and they actually explain why this happened to Jackie. And you'll notice I've drawn some connections here. We have to not only figure out these six things, we have to figure out what relationship these six things have to each other that might have affected why this crime occurred the way it did. Do you see how complex answering the question, why did this happen to Jackie, actually is? There's not an easy answer to this. We've talked about 7 pieces of evidence so far. Here's a diagram of all 7 pieces that I think are best explained by the existence of God outside the room. But now we're going to add an 8th piece, evil. And some people would say that that 8th piece is actually the best reason not to believe in God. I mean, think about it. You might have 7 good reasons to believe this suspect committed the crime, but if he tells you he wasn't even in the country and he can demonstrate that he wasn't there, he wasn't in the country at the time of the murder, he's got an alibi, then I don't care how good your 7 pieces are. You've misinterpreted him. He clearly didn't do it. Is this what evil is when it comes to God? Is evil, does that actually call exculpating evidence? Does evil exculpate God as a suspect in this case? Think about it. How could an all-loving, all-powerful God allow that to happen to Jackie? Either he's not all-powerful and he couldn't stop it, or he's not all-loving and he didn't care to stop it, or he doesn't exist. So we need to look at this issue of evil. Why would a loving, all-powerful God allow any act of evil to occur? That's a very similar question to why would a suspect do what they did to Jackie? Well, I think, again, it's going to come down to a series of explanations, just like it does with Jackie. Here's a diagram that I think illustrates all of the pieces that have to be in place. Number one, we have to understand what eternity and how eternity impacts the equation. We have to also know the proper role of free agency, the proper definition of love, how God might use this to develop our character, how God might even use this to call us to Him, also the consequence of our behavior just as justice demands, and finally, our limited understanding as humans. Now, you can see the diagram is pretty complex, and I think for purposes of us discussing this, much of this is going to be in your participant's guide, okay? Because we can't go through all 8 or 7 of these pieces of evidence or reasons, explanations in one setting. But I will try to do a couple that I think were so foundational for me as an atheist looking at the existence of God and trying to explain how evil could exist in the universe. Here's the first one. What do we mean when we say eternity changes everything? And it does in this equation. It's the first thing in the diagram. Well, let's put it this way. When I was an atheist, I believed that my life was a line segment. Follow me. Starts with birth, ends with death. 2 points, there's a line in between. I wanted the line to be 90 years. Just give me 90 years, 90 pain-free years. I don't want to ever suffer, ever experience any tragedies. I want to die peacefully in my sleep at the age of 90 after a very full and enjoyable life. That was my hope, right? Because for me as an atheist, everything had to occur in those first 90 years. Now, if I'd have gotten sick with, say, a cancer or some other disease at 40 and suffered 10 years and died at 50, I'd have been upset. I would have seen that as evil. Why? Because I had an expectation of 90 years on the timeline, and now the last half is being stolen from me. I'm not going to realize what I expected to begin with. I'd have seen that as evil. But what if my notion, my foundational notion of what life is, was wrong to begin with? What if life is not a line segment, but is instead a ray that starts at birth, extends through a point we call our death, but then goes off infinitely, eternally into the future like a ray? That's what rays do. They start, go through a point, and continue indefinitely. That would change everything. There are people who are watching this right now, maybe even in your group, that are watching this and have experienced some evil, some difficult surgery, maybe in the first few weeks of life. And if I would have stopped the camera right there and said, how's life going for you? You'd have said, it stinks. Okay, it's terrible. All I'm experiencing is pain. But by the time you were 3, you didn't even remember it. Really? I had a surgery when I don't know. Why? Because the context of your life determines the way you perceive evil. That was something you had to endure for a short period of time. By the time you're 3, 4, 5, you've already forgotten about it. Now think about this. If life is a ray and not a line segment, every year that you step into eternity, that 90-year period is shorter and shorter and shorter by comparison to eternity. You might suffer something, you might have a terrible 90 years, but by the time you're 1,000,000 years into eternity, that 90 years is a millisecond compared to your experience with God in eternity. If life is as Christianity describes it, the problem of evil has to be mitigated in some way. Look, I get it. Evil's a problem for me as an atheist, when I was an atheist, because I always thought everything had to happen in 90 years. But if that view is incorrect, if the Christian worldview is true, all of us are eternal creatures, and no matter what happens to you, it has to be measured in the context, not of 90 years, but of eternity. That's why eternity changes everything. Okay, look at our diagram again for a second. So we've looked at just one of 7 explanations for why God might allow any act of evil. The other 6 we'll cover in the participant's guide. But even this, the issue of eternity, goes a long way to explain why God would allow something bad to happen to us. He's not concerned about your comfort in your material life. He's concerned about your character through eternity. But we don't even know, really, if you look at this, what his priorities are. I mean, we don't know if his first priority is which one of those 7 things. All of this has to go into our description of why God would allow anything to happen. But now let me ask you this. Why are you calling this thing evil to begin with? Because you don't like it? You don't like what happened to Jackie? Look, if you don't like it, you can. If evil is just the stuff you don't like, well, you could actually eliminate all evil tomorrow. You know how you do it? Change your mind. But that won't get it done. You know that what happened to Jackie was truly evil. It broke a standard beyond your personal opinion, even beyond the opinion of your group. In other words, there's a standard that transcends all of us that you are measuring something against to determine that it's evil. C.S. Lewis once said it this way too. He said he used to complain about God's existence because the world is so unjust. But what was he measuring against when he called the world unjust? If there is no objective, transcendent, holy standard of righteousness, then there is no true evil. There's just stuff you don't like. But because there is true evil, we know there must therefore be an objective standard of righteousness. You cannot have the shadows without the sunlight. The shadows prove the sunlight. So even to say that something is evil is not to say that it eliminates God's existence. You couldn't have true evil if there wasn't a God to set the standard for righteousness. So let's go back to our diagram for a second. It used to be that people would say, hey, evil is that one thing that eliminates God from the equation. But it turns out you can't have that thing unless there is a God to set the standard. So evil is not exculpatory, it's inculpatory. It actually points, like all the other 7 pieces, to the existence of God as the standard. Look at our suspect description now. Just look at it for a second. Do you see what I see? Everything we've talked about in all those 8 pieces, it's there on that list, right? It's there on that list, the timeless nature of God, his non-material nature, everything from cosmology. He's a designer who fine-tunes the universe, is the author of the code in DNA. He's a mind who acts freely. All those attributes are there. He's also the standard for all moral truth, all moral righteousness by which we call something evil. Now look, here's why I offer this. If all I had was the evidence in the universe from science and philosophy, that's all I have, okay? I have no holy scripture, nothing. No holy book of any kind. I would have this suspect description we just described. I would be stuck looking for a suspect who fits that description. And it turns out that that description is exactly what we classically describe Yahweh as. The God of the Bible is that description, and we didn't open a single page of Scripture to get there. We got that description from just the physical evidence in the universe. Isn't it nice to know that our Scripture actually describes the world the way it really is? Now, look, people will try to offer other explanations for that evidence, and they will offer a multitude, and they do not agree with each other. The science does not agree with itself. You've got cosmologists who will argue over each and every piece of evidence, 4, 5, 6 different camps that are all in disagreement. They offer a multitude of coincidental explanations. And by the way, whatever they're using to explain the beginning of the universe, they're not using to explain moral law. They've got an entirely different set of explanations for all 8 pieces of evidence. That's one way to describe the evidence. That's one way to account for it. There's another way. There might just be one causal suspect that explains all the evidence, that unifies the entire evidence set. It's not this amazing cosmic coincidence of unrelated explanations. Instead, it's one explanation that can account for everything, from the beginning of the universe to even the standard by which we call something evil. We've been looking for a theory of everything to unify quantum mechanics, quantum physics to macro. Think about it. There is a theory of everything. It's called God. That's the one thing that explains all the evidence in the universe. And we got there by asking the simple question, can we explain everything in the room by staying in the room? You can't. The best explanation is outside the room, and it happens to match the God of the Bible.